All right, welcome everyone. We're in Philadelphia again, and behind me is Carpenters Hall. It's part of the Independence Hall National Historical Park, but it's not Independence Hall. Independence Hall is several buildings that way. Carpenters Hall is where the First Continental Congress met in 1774. Now, let me give you a little background of why the First Continental Congress was important in its relation to the Stamp Act Congress and the Second Continental Congress. So in the 1750s and 60s, the American colonies and the United Kingdom fought a war against the French, and here in America, some of their Native American allies. It was called the French and Indian War here. It was called the 7 Years' War in Europe. It actually lasted longer than 7 years, but in Europe it was only 7 years. So, of course, if you know your history, the British won that war. That made this part of North America British controlled, and the French lost control of almost all of their territory here in North America. The British Parliament started looking at this and they said, hey, this war was basically started in America. It was pretty much started by George Washington. That's another story. But the Americans started this war. We went over there and fought it for them. And we think that they should pay for it. They should help pay for this war. And so Parliament, that's the government in Britain, Parliament passed an act, or a series of acts, which raised taxes on the American colonies. So here's the problem with that. The Americans believed that they were British citizens and should be entitled to all the rights of British citizens, including representation by those who taxed them. That they needed to have representation in that body, whatever body taxed them. So the Americans felt like if Britain and the King wanted us to help pay for this war that had been fought for our sakes, basically, that all they had to do is tell us, and our own colonial legislatures could raise those taxes. If we allowed the Parliament to raise taxes on us, the Americans, then that would essentially make the Americans slaves. The British Parliament could raise whatever taxes they wanted. If they could raise a little bit, they could raise the taxes to everything and confiscate everything, is the idea behind that. And so if you're working and not able to receive the fruits of your labor, then that's basically slavery. So that was the American position. A man by the name of John Dickinson, who's my favorite founding father that almost nobody's ever heard of. You've probably never heard of him. He was he had a farm in Pennsylvania, and he was also from Delaware. He later became a delegate to the Constitutional Convention from Delaware. John Dickinson wrote a series of basically editorials in the newspapers of the time, and published them and published them as broadsides also to pamphlets to pass out. It was called the Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. And in these letters, he spelled out how this constitutional system, that as we saw it and as the British saw it. So Parliament was trying to impose a system much like it had with Ireland, where the Irish did not have representation in Parliament. There were some exceptions to that. You had to be Protestant, and most Irish were Catholics. But for the most part, the Parliament ruled Ireland as basically their own little fiefdom. And Americans saw that as an extension through these tax acts that Parliament was trying to do that in America also. Well, the American colonists viewed their constitutional relationship with the United Kingdom as one somewhat like the Scots before the acts of unification came in, I want to say 1601 or 1607, something like that. So Scotland had its own parliament, but they also gave allegiance to the king of the United Kingdom. That's why it was called the United Kingdom. It was the United Kingdom of Scotland and England together. But England had its parliament, Scotland had its parliament. That's how the Americans saw that this relationship should be. We were under the king and his government, but our lawmaking should happen at the local level in our colonies. The English Parliament still had authority to regulate trade throughout the empire for the benefit of everyone in the empire, but they couldn't just come in and raise taxes in one specific area, was the perspective of the Americans as put forward by John Dickinson in these letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. So that was the Americans' perspective. That was the real crux of the contention between America and the United Kingdom that led up to the Revolutionary War. So in 1765, the Americans came together, most of the colonies, not all, most of the colonies, sent representatives to this meeting called the Stamp Act Congress. And in this Congress, they set forward a declaration of resolves and grievances that they had, and they kind of listed these things like, hey, you shouldn't be taxing us without our representation, things like that. And so they sent kind of a watered down version of this, a nicer version, to King and to the House of Lords in London, and requested some changes in the arrangement here as from the perspective that we saw it. That worked to some extent. I mean, the history of the Stamp Act and the tea tax and all of that, you can read about that in your history book. So leading up to the American Revolution in 1770, of course, you got the Boston Massacre. People are not happy about that. And then in 1773 comes this uprising in Boston, the Boston Tea Party, where the people of Boston were upset about this tax on tea because, again, if you can tax a little bit, then you can tax anything. And the British were trying to slip it in under the radar. They got a whole bunch of surplus tea, sent it to America at way reduced price, but then said, and we're going to put on a little bit of tax. So the price was actually way less than what the Americans had been paying, but they had to have this little bit of tax added on. And with this, the British Parliament, the English Parliament, asserted their right to tax the American people. And this did not go over well with people in America. The ships were turned away in most ports, but the governor in Boston decided to bring the ship into port, and that really angered the people, and so they dressed up like Mohawks and went and dumped all the tea in the harbor, which made it undrinkable even for Americans. If you remember your Mary Poppins, thank you. If you remember your Mary Poppins, that's what that song was about, or what's his name's talking about. Anyway, if you remember your Mary Poppins. So, in response to that, the British passed a series of acts that they called the coercive acts. They wanted to coerce Boston and Massachusetts into obeying their authority, basically. And in America, it was known as the intolerable acts. These were not to be tolerated. It closed the port of Boston, so no trade in or out. It shut down the government, the local government in Boston. It did a bunch of other really restrictive things. And so this infuriated not only the people of Boston, but people all up and down the colony saw, hey, if they can do it to Massachusetts, they can do it to us. And so they got together in this First Continental Congress in 1774 here in this building. And they were looking to see, okay, what do we do about these coercive acts? So they sent another petition to King and Parliament. This was called the Declaration of Rights, and they sent that to King and Parliament. Again, calling for a peaceful solution, right? Saying, here's how we view things. Let's get together and talk about this. King and Parliament had nothing to do with it. So this First Continental Congress that met in 1774 right here in Carpenters Hall, they put together this Declaration of Resolves, sent it off to the king, sent it off to Parliament, and then said, okay, let's meet again together in 1 year and we'll see what the response is. That's about how long it took to get something, across the sea to Britain and then get the response back. Well, Britain didn't ever respond. They said, this is ridiculous. We're not going to have anything to do with this. So eventually, you got the British in Boston getting nervous. Hey, these colonials, they're stockpiling weapons and ammunition. We're going to go get that at this place called Concord. We're going to send some troops out to confiscate this stuff, bring it back. Well, the word went out. The Minutemen came together at the Green at Lexington, shot heard around the world. The British kept going to Concord, and by that time the Americans had hidden all of the arms and ammunition, and then on the way back you got thousands of Minutemen converging on this British force that's trying to march back to Boston. And then, of course, people from all over the colonies converged and surrounded Boston and besieged it. And so that was the situation when the Second Continental Congress convened in Independence Hall, like I said, about 3 buildings over here, in 1775. They started discussing things, and there were some like John Adams, Samuel Adams, who said, hey, the war's already begun, right? This was Patrick Henry's line. War is already begun. Why stand we here idle? So to them, hey, let's just call for independence, break away from Britain. But no, there was another group led by John Dickinson and some others who said, we need to send another petition, make one more try to reconcile things with Britain. And so they sent one more petition. It was called the Olive Branch Petition. It was supposed to be an offering of peace, saying, hey, we are ready to talk about this. We need to work this out peacefully. Completely ignored by King and Parliament. So there's 3 times the American colonists, raised a standard of peace to the British and said, hey, we need to talk about this. Let's not get hasty. Let's not fight about this. We need to discuss this. 3 times they were ignored by the British. And the British continued to try to impose their will on the Americans through force. I believe that this was fulfilling an ancient command that God gave to his people, that when an enemy came against them, they were to raise a standard of peace. And he promised that if they did this, not once, not twice, but 3 times, they would be blessed and God would fight their battles for them. Not only then, but to the 3rd and 4th generation, their children and their children's children. I believe we were blessed with that in the United States because we started out the right way. We started out lifting a standard of peace to the British. Not once, not twice, but 3 times with the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, the Declaration of Resolves, and the Olive Branch Petition. 3 separate Congresses sent petitions to Great Britain, raising a standard of peace, and it was ignored. And God not only raised up friends to help us, as Patrick Henry almost prophesied, God raised up the very elements to fight the battles for the Americans, as we'll see in Boston, as we'll see in Brooklyn, as we'll see at Assunpunk Creek, as we'll see at Yorktown. The God of nature raised up the very elements to fight the battles for this people who had followed his ancient commands. That is providential history. That is history you probably aren't going to hear anywhere else. And thank you for joining us.